Harvard, 12 days after Christmas, 1969. A heavy, uneasy silence filled room 6B at 6 University Road in Cambridge. Something wasn't right. Donald Mitchell, a fellow anthropology student, noticed immediately when Jane Briton didn't show up for their study group that morning. They were preparing for the upcoming general exams, the kind of test that could define a scholar's career. By 9:25 a.m., concern got the better of him. He walked over to Jane's room and knocked. No response. The door was slightly ajar. When he pushed it open, what he saw froze him in place. Within seconds, he turned and ran for help. When police first arrived in Cambridge, they found the brutally murdered body of 23-year-old Jane Briton, a Harvard anthropology student who was known for both her brilliant mind and her warm heart. She lay slumped beside her bed, the marks of blunt force trauma clear in her body. But it wasn't just the violence that shocked investigators. It was the scene itself. Her body had been dusted with a strange reddish-brown powder, red ochre, and on her chest lay an ancient clay shard. Her wallet was untouched, the door unlocked, 2 windows open just a crack. There were no signs of forced entry. Everything about the scene suggested something eerily personal, almost ceremonial. It didn't just feel like a murder. It felt like a message. Before we continue this haunting story, hit subscribe and like this video. Your support helps keep stories like Jane's from being forgotten. And it lets the algorithm gods know you want more truth brought to light. The murder of Jane Briton would haunt Harvard University and the Cambridge community alike for 50 continuous years. A bright life taken, a family that searched far and wide for answers that never came. But Jane's death was more than just a tragic loss. It exposed the cracks beneath Harvard's polished surface. It became the first glimpse of how the university regularly valued its reputation above all else. Jane's father was no ordinary parent. J. Boyd Briton was a well-respected professor and the vice president of Radcliffe College, the sister institution to Harvard. When the daughter of such a man was murdered just steps from campus, and security flaws became obvious, Harvard scrambled to protect itself. The truth, however messy, took a back seat to public image. Investigators soon found themselves caught between justice and politics. There was pressure, spoken and unspoken, to find someone to blame, but not one of their own. And so, as Harvard's walls stayed pristine, the real killer slipped quietly into the shadows, where he'd remain for decades. All the while, a microscopic clue one overlooked biological trace waited patiently in an evidence box. It would take half a century for science to uncover what Harvard once buried. Before we go any further, I'd like to know, where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below. It's amazing to see how far these stories travel and how they bring us together across time and space. Today, we'll revisit that cold January night in 1969. We'll follow the decades of frustration, the mistakes, the secrets, and finally the discovery that brought Jane's case back to life and in some small way delivered justice. This is a story of loss, persistence, deception, and justice delayed, but never fully complete. Jane Marie Briton was born in Boston, Massachusetts on May 11, 1945, to Ruth and J. Boyd Briton. She was the eldest of 2 children with a younger brother, Boyd Jr. The Britons were an accomplished, deeply respected family, intellectuals through and through. J. Boyd Briton was a distinguished professor and vice president at Radcliffe College, while Ruth Briton was active in local academic and social circles, admired for her wit and warmth. Since childhood, Jane was a noticeable girl, bright, independent, and curious about everything. Teachers spoke of her as a pupil who didn't just memorize the facts but questioned them. Her interest gravitated toward history and languages, but archaeology stole her heart. And this was the 1950s, a time when women were often encouraged toward more traditional paths. But Jane? She wasn't one to follow the crowd. She wanted to dig literally into the secrets of ancient civilizations. By the time she graduated from Radcliffe College, Jane was already a force to be reckoned with. Her senior thesis on Mesopotamian burial practices awed even her professors. She had this incredible ability to make the past feel alive, says her brother Boyd in a 2015 interview. Jane saw things other people didn't. She would look deeper, always after the truth. In 1967, she graduated summa cum laude and gained admission to Harvard's prized anthropology program, a dream come true. By 1969, Jane was 23, living at 6 University Road, and just days away from taking her general exams, the gateway to her doctoral research. Professors admired her sharp insights, especially with regard to the reading of ancient texts and artifacts. She was poised for a brilliant career, but fate and someone's dark intentions would intervene before she ever got the chance to fulfill it. Cambridge is a picturesque, ivy-clad town, a blend of history, intellect, and quiet charm. Yet just a short distance from campus, the old building at 6 University Road was one of those places which, though it looked warm and inviting from without, was badly scarred on the inside by years of wear and neglect. This wasn't a Harvard dorm per se, but rather university-owned housing, mainly filled with grad students in anthropology. That sort of place where everyone knew one another's names, where the doors were always open, sometimes literally. This building's ground floor entrance was notoriously left unlocked, a reflection of the easy trust which defined that era. It's almost unthinkable now looking back, but in the late 60s, safety just wasn't something people talked much about. The locks didn't always catch, windows stuck open, and we just assumed nothing bad could ever happen here, Professor Alistair Finch remembered. At the time, he was a faculty member living there. It was Harvard, after all. We thought we were safe. Jane Briton lived on one of the upper floors. Her door latch, like many others, had been broken for months. She couldn't lock it even if she'd wanted to. Add to that the easy access through windows and fire escapes, and the building might as well have been an open invitation to anyone who wanted to come inside. In that flawed old building, Jane had constructed a dense but complicated life. Deeply in the anthropology department, she spent long hours cataloging artifacts in the Peabody Museum, attended lectures, and participated in the Near East Archaeology Society. Her journal, later found in her room, offered glimpses of a young woman balancing immense academic pressure with personal struggle. The weight of expectation, complicated romances, and the challenge of standing her ground in a field still dominated by men. It had been just another Monday for all who had seen her. Friends, professors, and even her own notes from that morning confirmed that Jane did the things she always did. She went to her 9 a.m. seminar on Sumerian linguistics, a course she loved, then to a tense 11:30 meeting with her advisor, Professor C.C. Lamberg-Karlofsky. The two had a rocky academic relationship. He'd just flunked her on a key practice exam and had warned her that if she didn't pass her upcoming general exams, her academic career could be over. Her classmate, David Sterling, said he had seen her afterward, shoulders tense, expression resolute. She looked like someone who'd just been knocked down but refused to stay there, he recalled. After that, Jane had a late lunch by herself at a campus cafe, going over her notes quietly. By mid-afternoon, she was back in her comfort zone, the archives of the Peabody Museum, surrounded by ancient artifacts and fragments of history. She worked there intensely until about 5:30 p.m. That evening, at 6:45, she met her boyfriend, Jim Humphreys, another grad student, for dinner at a small Italian restaurant off campus. The conversation, he later told police, drifted from academic stress to their time together in Iran during a recent dig. The trip had been difficult, both had fallen ill, and the strain had lingered in their relationship. They argued not dramatically, but enough to leave Jane quiet and tired. She wanted to go home. At approximately 8:30 p.m., Jane returned to 6 University Road. Her housemate Donald Mitchell walked with her. They'd both been at the dinner, before parting ways in the hallway. Jane made a brief stop to chat with another couple down the hall, Maya Sharma and Thomas Reed. Maya later told detectives that Jane had seemed preoccupied, but still energized, full of ideas for her upcoming exam. She talked about a new theory she was forming, Maya said, but you could tell she was exhausted. When Maya offered her tea, Jane declined politely. "I just need to sleep," she'd said. Her final journal entry, written shortly before midnight, captured her state of mind. "Exams tomorrow. Karlovsky breathing down my neck, but he will not break me. I must articulate the thesis on ritual symbolism clearly. A distraction this evening helped clear my head, but now I must focus." My future depends on this. Donald Mitchell started the day expecting a routine study session with Jane. By 9 a.m., she hadn't arrived. That was strange. Jane was never late. He thought maybe she'd overslept at first. But as the minutes ticked by, a gnawing unease took hold. At 9:25, he walked down the hall and knocked on her door. No answer. He knocked again, and again, with no response. The door was ajar. That was normal for Jane, but something about the silence just felt wrong. He called over another student, Thomas Reed, to check with him. Together they hesitated, then gently pushed the door open. Inside, the room was dark, quiet, and then the sight neither man would ever forget. They immediately retreated, shut the door, and ran to the phone to call the police. In a matter of minutes, uniformed officers and detectives, led by Sergeant Peter Sennett, a seasoned investigator, and his younger partner, officer, arrived. Detective Lena Walsh arrived within minutes. She sent a crisp and clinical report of what had happened that morning at 6 University Road. Female victim, approximately 23 years of age, lying supine on the floor near the bed. Blunt force trauma to the head is visible. The body was dusted with fine reddish-brown powder. The apartment was undisturbed. Door unlocked, 2 windows slightly opened, and no signs of forced entry. Even for seasoned officers, it was a disturbing tableau. That strange powder immediately set the case apart. The quiet old building became abuzz with activity before 10 a.m. Detectives, photographers, and technicians navigated the narrow halls with caution as word of the murder spread quickly throughout Harvard and the greater Cambridge community. Students congregated outside in the cold winter air, whispering to one another in disbelief. Soon after, Cambridge medical examiner Dr. Arthur Gaines arrived. His initial estimate put Jane's time of death somewhere in the window, between 11:30 p.m. Monday night and 2 a.m. Tuesday morning. She was still dressed in her daytime clothes, a blouse and skirt, not pajamas. Whatever had happened, it wasn't an attack in her sleep. This blow to the head, Dr. Gaines noted, had been savage. But as investigators combed through the room, it became clear something far stranger was at play. Jane's wallet, still in her purse, contained $67 in cash, untouched. Nothing appeared stolen. Her notes and textbooks lay open on her desk, as though she'd been studying when someone, perhaps someone familiar, came to her door. And then came the discovery that ran a shiver through the entire investigating team. A small, ancient clay, shard likely Mesopotamian in origin, had been carefully placed onto her chest. Circling her body and dusting the floor around her was a layer of reddish-brown powder. Testing would later confirm it to be red ochre, a pigment long associated with ancient burial rites. To Detective Sergeant Peter Sennett, the meaning was unmistakable. This wasn't just a killing, it was a performance, a message. But what kind of message? And from whom? As Dr. Gaines finished his exam, another piece of evidence deepened the mystery. There were clear signs of recent sexual activity within hours of her death. This suggested Jane had been with someone she knew, someone she trusted enough to let inside her unlocked room. Given the building's notoriously lax security, one of the rookie officers present, Patrolman Sam Davies, asked his superior if perhaps someone had merely wandered in. His question was dismissed with a wave. The senior detectives were convinced the answer lay closer to home, among Jane's circle of colleagues, classmates, and friends. By noon, the murder was headline news. Local radio stations interrupted their regular programming. The Boston Globe and Cambridge Chronicle scrambled reporters to the scene. Inside Harvard's administration building, phones rang continuously. An emergency meeting was called. Dean Charles Prescott, visibly rattled, made one thing clear. "The reputation of this institution is paramount," he said. "We cannot afford scandal, especially given Miss Briton's family ties." In a matter of hours, panicked calls from parents overflowed into the housing office. "It felt like the world had stopped," said Mrs. Agnes Peterson, who worked as a secretary. Students were crying. Nobody felt safe anymore. Across Cambridge, the impact was immediate. Shops closed early, churches opened for prayer. The mayor appeared on local television, urging calm and vowing that every available resource would be devoted to catching the killer. Meanwhile, detectives were working methodically, collecting every shred of potential evidence. There were 2 partially filled wine glasses on a small table near her desk, with only her fingerprints. Fibers were lifted from the carpet. Tiny fragments of skin were found under Jane's fingernails. Signs she'd fought back, even briefly. And most importantly, the medical examiner preserved a semen sample discovered in her underwear. Although in 1969, such evidence could reveal little more than the fact of sexual contact, technology that could analyze DNA was still decades away. Still, Sergeant Sennett was cautious. In a brief news conference last night, he said, "We're treating everything as potential evidence." Notably, he did not mention the red ochre evidence of a deliberately kept secret. It was one of those details reserved for only a few detectives who were afraid of releasing it to avoid false confessions and sensational rumors. What none of them realized at the time was that this single haunting detail, the clay shard and the red dust, would be the key someday to solving Jane Briton's murder. Early on, Detective Sennett and his team made an important decision: to keep the more sensational aspects of the case, most particularly those involving the red ochre, strictly confidential. They anticipated public panic, sensational headlines, and worst of all, copycat crimes. "At this stage, we have more questions than answers," Sennett said in a tense press briefing where his tone was steady but strained. "But let me assure both the university and wider community that this case is our absolute priority. Harvard is cooperating fully, and we have the full support of the university." It was the kind of line meant to assuage the public. But among the journalists present, there was an unmistakable sense that something was being left unsaid. By the morning of Wednesday, January 8, 1969, investigators were hard at work reconstructing Jane Briton's final hours. They cross-referenced witness accounts, pored over her journals, and charted minute-by-minute timelines. Yet the picture that emerged served only to deepen the mystery. The first big challenge was to determine who could have visited Jane that night. Her journal did not mention expecting any company, and none of her friends remembered any plans for her to meet anyone. The evidence spoke a different story, though. Two recently used wine glasses, signs of recent intimacy, and no forced entry. Detective Sennett noted privately in his case log, "Physical evidence shows visitor known to the victim. No one has come forward. Either stranger gained her trust instantly, or someone close is hiding." It was an unsettling thought. The second major problem was the building itself. Security at 6 University Road was, to put it succinctly, non-existent. There were no visitor logs, no guards, and no functioning locks on many of the doors. The ground floor entrance was all but perpetually left open, and students made a habit of propping windows or fire doors for convenience. As investigators would learn, the door latch in Jane's own room was already broken when she moved in, and Harvard never fixed it. Almost 60% of the locks on rooms in the building were said to be non-functioning. One longtime campus security guard, Howard Jenkins, acknowledged it had been an open secret. "Students came and went as they pleased," he told detectives. "Everyone just assumed no one would ever cause trouble. In 20 years here, I've never seen anything like this." That naive trust, the sense that danger couldn't possibly intrude on Harvard's hallowed ground, had now cost a young woman her life. The first major suspect was clear: Jim Humphreys, Jane's boyfriend. Their relationship had been strained, and they'd argued the night before her death. In many murder cases, detectives knew that combination was often telling. Humphreys was questioned 3 separate times. He said he returned to his own apartment after dinner, drank too much, and passed out. The story at first sounded flimsy, but his roommate corroborated that he heard him stumble in late that night, and phone records supported his timeline. Humphreys also passed a polygraph test, and no forensic evidence connected him to the scene. Frustrated but thorough, investigators eventually ruled him out. That left the red ochre. This strange, ritualistic detail pointed to someone with knowledge of anthropology, perhaps even someone within Jane's own department. And that suspicion turned attention to one man in particular, Professor C.C. Lamberg-Karlofsky, Jane's academic advisor. Brilliant and intense, Karlofsky was an intimidating figure to some students. His reputation for arrogance and a rumored fascination with female students did little to help him fit comfortably into the mentor mold. Added to the academic tension between them, she had recently failed one of his practice exams. The situation had all the makings of a volatile dynamic. Detectives brought him in for questioning. His alibi was simple. He'd been home with his wife. She confirmed it, and investigators found no physical evidence tying him to the scene. No fingerprints, no fibers, nothing. Yet Sennett couldn't shake the feeling that the red ochre was too specific, too deliberate. "It feels like one of our own," he confided in his notes, a chilling acknowledgement that the killer might be hiding in plain sight among Harvard scholars. Meanwhile, rumors swirled across campus. A young reporter at the Harvard Crimson named Rachel Porter started to dig into Karlovsky's past, searching for patterns in any previous complaints from female students. She soon reached a dead end. The administration wouldn't grant her interviews, citing privacy concerns. Years later, Porter would describe her frustration. He was never asked to take a polygraph test. Everyone else was. It felt like a deliberate decision to protect him, or the institution. Meanwhile, with rumors circulating in hushed whispers through the lecture halls and coffee shops of Harvard, the case against Karlovsky simply collapsed under the weight of his alibi and the absence of hard evidence. With nowhere else to turn, detectives widened their focus, and soon another anthropology graduate student, Mike. As the investigation wore on, detectives began to focus their attention on another graduate student, Mike Gramley, a quiet but intense young man deeply immersed in archaeological theory. Gramley admitted he'd known Jane casually. They'd even shared tea once, but insisted he had nothing to do with her death. His alibi seemed solid. He'd been studying late that night at Harvard's Widener Library. A librarian's sign-out sheet confirmed it, as did a fellow student who remembered seeing him there until closing time. Next came Professor Lee Parsons, a respected anthropologist recently brought in to oversee the prestigious Peabody Museum. Because he had full access to archaeological materials, including red ochre, detectives had no choice but to question him. Parsons told investigators he'd been homesick with the flu. His wife initially confirmed the story, though later admitted she'd been heavily medicated and asleep for most of the night, meaning she couldn't be completely sure he hadn't slipped out. Still, without any physical evidence tying him to the scene, Parsons too was cleared. By late January, all of the immediate suspects, Jane's professors, classmates, and close acquaintances, had been ruled out. Each had an alibi. None could be linked by evidence. It was a devastating setback. The forensic analysis, limited by 1969's primitive technology, offered little help. The two wine glasses found near Jane's desk clear evidence of a guest carried only her fingerprints. Any others had been wiped clean or were too smudged to trace. Carpet fibers turned up nothing distinctive, and that semen sample, carefully preserved by the medical examiner, was as close to a dead end as science could get at the time. Dr. Arthur Gaines would later sigh in interviews. "We had the key right there in our hands, but no way to open the lock." Detective Sergeant Sennett shared that frustration. On February 15, 1969, he wrote a confidential memo to his superior, Lieutenant William Hayes, that they were dealing with either incredible luck or terrifying precision. This was no act of random violence, he believed. Jane's killer had been invited in, had spent time with her, and had known exactly how to leave without leaving a trace. But as Sennett chased leads, Harvard's administration grew uneasy. Dean Charles Prescott, under subtle pressure from influential trustees like Robert A. Linton, began to push for a resolution, or at least quiet. The university's image was at stake. Soon, a so-called security consultant, Dr. Elias Thorne, was brought in. His official role was to review campus safety, but in reality, he acted as a buffer, keeping the investigation contained and the press at bay. The message was unmistakable: solve this or stop talking about it. By the time Jane's body was finally released to her family, the investigation had reached its first standstill. No witnesses, no clear motive, just that haunting scene filled with red ochre and unanswered questions. Hundreds attended the funeral in Radnor, Pennsylvania, friends and professors and classmates and townspeople who'd followed the case in the papers. Jane's father, J. Boyd Briton, stood tall through the ceremony, his grief masked by years of academic discipline. But as the casket lowered into the ground, his composure finally broke. Beside him, Jane's mother, Ruth, faced the cameras after the service. Her face streaked with tears. She spoke firmly. "Someone out there knows what happened to Jane. We beg you, come forward, nobody did. What the Briton family and even the detectives couldn't have realized at the time was that evidence that would someday solve the case was already in their possession, sealed away in a small, dusty evidence box. It wasn't until more than 50 years later that technology would unlock its secret, and when it finally did, the truth proved to be as unsettling as it was inconvenient. The silence was heavier than grief itself when the family returned to their Radnor home after Jane's funeral. Her father, once a brilliant, commanding lecturer, slowly began to fade from his own life. He spent long hours in his study, surrounded by Jane's notes and unfinished drafts, unable to put them away. His colleagues noted he spoke in a softer tone now, his voice quivering whenever her name came up in conversation. Ruth, who used to be so warm and in the midst of the community, was now utterly closed up. Gone was the laughter. She no longer invited dinners, and local charity events were no longer a drop-in affair. Above all, she stayed clear of Harvard. The Britons were not just mourning their daughter, they were mourning the future she'd been denied. And somewhere out there, her killer walked freely, probably convinced he'd gotten away with it. Ruth Briton couldn't stand the silence anymore. Friends would later recall how she spent hours by the kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea gone cold, staring out into the distance, as if waiting for someone or something to come home. Their son, Boyd Jr., only 14 at the time, remembered the house as unbearably still. It wasn't just quiet, he said years later. It felt like the air itself had stopped moving. For the Britons, the grief incrementally gave way to a fierce resolve. When in September 1969, the investigation was finally suspended, Jane's father, J. Boyd Briton, refused to let go. He began keeping fastidious notes. Every phone call with detectives, every scrap of a newspaper article, every whispered rumor from Harvard's campus. By the time he died in 1998, those files lined multiple shelves in his study. It was a father's desperate attempt to bring order to chaos, to find justice for the daughter taken from him. Meanwhile, Harvard itself was on the hot seat. Media started digging into negligence on the part of the university. Broken locks, poor maintenance, and just a complete lack of basic student security. What had once been whispered behind closed doors now exploded into the public eye. Students and faculty organized demonstrations, demanding accountability. Even parents of Harvard students joined in, saying the administration ignored obvious safety risks. Under intense pressure, University President Nathan M. Pusey called an emergency press conference to offer condolences to the Briton family and to promise sweeping reforms. Within weeks, new locks were installed in every Harvard-owned dorm, and a dedicated security department was formed. But for Ruth Briton, those changes came too late. She quietly wrote to trustees and lawmakers, urging real transparency and reform. Harvard has the resources to protect its students, she wrote, but perhaps not yet the conscience. As the years went by, the fight for justice for the Britons became generational. Their son, Boyd Jr., carved out a path deeply shaped by loss. He abandoned an early career in finance to become an investigative journalist. He vowed his life to telling the stories of cold case victims and families who'd been left behind. Though professional ethics prevented him from ever directly covering his sister's case, he carried Jane's files wherever he went. At a 1990 conference on unsolved crimes, he spoke with quiet conviction. "I can't bring my sister back, but I can make sure her silence isn't forgotten. And the institutions that failed her are never allowed to forget her." Public attention came and went in waves. The 5th anniversary in 1974 brought a feature in the Boston Globe titled "The Harvard Mystery 5 Years On." 10 years later, a TV documentary revisited the story, interviewing detectives and the grieving Britons. Both pieces echoed the same haunting truth, no forced entry, a likely known assailant, and a lingering unease that the university might have played a larger role than it wanted to admit. The case files themselves had their own odyssey. Moved from the active case room to the archives in 1970, then to a county records facility in 1982. There was a flood in 1997, during which an unsung hero, clerk Brenda Miller, quietly made a heroic choice, hoisting the boxes of Briton evidence onto her shoulders and carrying them upstairs as water began to rise, refusing to let them be destroyed. Her simple act of care, unheralded at the time, would prove crucial 2 decades later. By its 20th anniversary in 1989, Jane's murder had faded into something between tragedy and campus legend, the kind of story new students whispered about late at night. That year, the Harvard Crimson ran a retrospective piece riddled with small factual errors. Ruth Briton wasn't about to let it stand. In an indignant letter to the editor, she reminded, "My daughter's death is not folklore. It is our ongoing nightmare, and Harvard's continued silence only deepens it." While technically still open, Jane's case had slipped to the background as newer crimes took public attention. Yet Detective Sergeant Peter Sennett, who had led the original investigation, never truly moved on. Every January 7th, the anniversary of Jane's death, he quietly requested to review the file. It became his personal ritual, a silent promise to a young woman the system had forgotten. His old supervisor, Lieutenant William Hayes, later told interviewers that Sennett was haunted by the Briton case. Every year, Hayes remembered, he'd spread those files out on his desk, like maybe, just maybe, he'd spot something new. By the 25th anniversary in 1994, hope flickered again. The advent of DNA technology gave detectives a new reason to believe the case might finally be solved. In 1996, Commander Thomas Brennan, who had been a rookie officer on the scene back in '69, authorized the first official cold case review. For 6 weeks, a small determined team re-examined every scrap of evidence and re-interviewed surviving witnesses. Renewing the forensic process led to the repackaging of Jane Briton's remaining evidence with care. The most critical piece of evidence, the preserved biological sample from her underwear, was placed into sterile containers and transferred into a secure refrigeration unit under the supervision of the forensic technician, Dr. Elena Rodriguez. "If there's still viable DNA here," she said at the time, "we've given it the best possible chance of survival." What nobody at that moment in time realized was that they had just safeguarded the very key with which science, decades later, finally opened the vault of this mystery. In 1998, the first DNA test on the evidence was tried, but at that time, the technology was too primitive to provide much. The testing process consumed a large portion of the sample while producing frustratingly inconclusive results. That was a devastating blow for investigators, nearly destroying the one piece of evidence that could identify the killer. "We were ahead of the science," Commander Thomas Brennan said at a press conference that year. "But we've preserved what remains, and someday when the technology catches up to our determination, this case will be solved. And when it does, I hope Harvard will finally commit to full transparency." By the 30th anniversary in 1999, Jane's murder had been officially reviewed 5 times. Each new review tried to incorporate the latest forensic advancements: fingerprint automation, microscopic fiber analysis, and even psychological statement analysis. Tools unimaginable in 1969. Still, every round ended the same way: no arrest, no closure. By the 40th anniversary in 2009, sentiment had shifted. What was once viewed as a cold case in wait for progress now felt like an unsolvable wound, buried beneath layers of institutional secrecy. The Boston Globe framed that mood best with its headline, "40 years later, has justice for Jane Briton become impossible?" At 90 years of age and in failing health, Ruth Briton gave what many believed was her final interview. "I've accepted that I may not live to see Jane's killer brought to justice," she said softly, "but I believe that day will come." Science keeps advancing, and people's consciences trouble them as they age. Secrets are hard to keep, especially dark ones. Someone knows something, and someday that knowledge will see the light of day, even if it implicates some who have tried to bury the truth. What Ruth couldn't have known was that the very breakthrough she was praying for was already quietly forming through a new forensic method that would go on to revolutionize cold case investigations around the world: genetic genealogy. And fatefully, the first ripple in this transformation began back where it all started, at Harvard. In 2009, on the 40th anniversary of Jane Briton's murder, a whispered rumor began to circulate among students. It eventually reached the ears of Becky Cooper, a young sophomore, a curious and determined mind who loved history as much as she distrusted tidy answers. The story she heard was dark and dramatic, A Harvard professor was said to have beaten a female student to death and then sprinkled red ochre dust over her body, an ancient burial ritual turned grotesque. The alleged motive, a forbidden affair. The student threatened to expose it, whereupon the professor silenced her permanently. No one said the name directly, at least not at first. But then, through late-night conversations in Harvard Yard, one name kept coming up over and over: Professor C. Karl Lamberg Karlofsky. He was still there, a towering theatrical figure, known for his sweeping lectures, his brilliant mind, and yes, his signature cape. He walked Harvard's halls as if untouched by rumor, teaching new generations of students, his reputation intact. Karlofsky had been Jane Briton's faculty advisor. He had once failed her on a key exam, criticized her fieldwork, and, if the whispers were true, carried a secret darker than any archaeological mystery he had ever studied. The story consumed Becky Cooper. She started researching every scrap of Jane's case, from old Boston Post headlines to buried police notes. Many believed the Cambridge police had bungled the investigation and that Harvard, fearful of scandal, had quietly ensured the story disappeared. In 2012, by now a Harvard alumna herself, Cooper signed up for a seminar taught by none other than Professor Karlofsky, then 74 years old. Sharp, eccentric, and often draped in his signature cloak, he was still a commanding presence. The rumors hadn't faded. If anything, they'd become part of his mythology. Then Cooper became determined to find the truth. Not just about Jane, but also whether an elite institution could really keep a secret of this size for this long. The more she dug, the less evidence she could find that Karlofsky and Briton had ever had a romantic relationship. Still, rumors persisted. One former PhD student, Peter Rodman, remembered hearing a rumor that Jane had once threatened a member of her general exam committee, purportedly warning she would reveal an affair if she failed. And the professor in question, the whispers said, was Karlofsky himself. The rumor at the heart of the decades-old whispers that Jane Briton had been involved with Professor Karlofsky remained just that, a rumor. When Becky Cooper later confronted Karlofsky, he seemed almost unnervingly calm about the decades of suspicion surrounding him, adding to his imposing and enigmatic presence. But Cooper wasn't about to be distracted. She widened her net. Jane's former boyfriend, Jim Humphreys, was considered, as their relationship had its stressors. She also went back to Mike Gramley, a Harvard anthropology graduate student who had also known Jane. Gramley was an intense, passionate individual, and suspicion deepened when it emerged he had been investigated in the mysterious disappearance of another female student, Anne Abraham, 7 years after Jane's murder in Labrador, Canada. Anne's body was never found, but her parents believed she was killed. Gramley did deny any involvement with Jane, and even pressed police himself for news on the case. As Gramley faded as a primary suspect in Cooper's mind, he provided her with a tantalizing new lead: a box of red ochre found in storage at the Peabody Museum, one small handful missing. Gramley suspected the box had belonged to the museum's lab director at the time, Professor Lee Parsons, who intriguingly had been alone with Jane on at least one occasion. Cooper, egged on by an indefatigable Briton Jr., began zeroing in on Parsons. Parsons joined Harvard in 1968, but after he left the university, never having gotten a promised promotion, he struggled with various personal demons. He had been openly gay, had a penchant for heavy drinking, and often erupted in violent fits. Parsons' close friend, Stephen Loring, later recalled to Cooper his friend's admitted accusation of murder during a dig in Guatemala, with Loring telling Cooper that he believed his friend might actually be guilty. The problem was that Parsons died in 1996 from AIDS, so direct questioning was impossible. Cooper pored over each police interview Parsons had given, along with any reports from other figures in Jane's life. She requested the complete case file from the Cambridge Police Department on multiple occasions, but officials, protective of their original investigation, continued to reject her request, citing ongoing procedural concerns. In cooperation with Boyd Briton Jr., Cooper had access to parts of Jane's original case files, which included photocopies of police reports, coroner's notes, and correspondence preserved by the Briton family. She was also allowed to read Jane's personal journals and photographs, which Boyd shared for the first time since his parents had died. Her relentless investigation eventually caught the attention of the Boston Globe's Spotlight team, which agreed to collaborate with her on a story. The resulting public pressure led the Cambridge police to acknowledge a long-hidden truth. Critical biological evidence from the crime scene still existed. Among the preserved materials was a semen sample recovered from Jane's clothing, long considered too degraded to yield any results. For decades, investigators had doubted it could ever be useful, until science caught up. Enter genetic genealogy, an unprecedented technique that began in 2018. The technique utilizes commercial DNA databases to find suspects through family connections, and had solved the infamous Golden State Killer case back in April of that year. It broke crimes that had gone unsolved for decades. The breakthrough sent shockwaves through law enforcement and the public alike. Meanwhile, in Cambridge, the developments were being closely followed by an experienced cold case investigator, Sergeant Amelia Clark, who had inherited Jane Briton's case file since 2015. Though Commander Thomas Brennan was retired by then, he was still personally invested and advised Clark as she painstakingly reconstructed the investigation from decades earlier. She digitized records, evidence logs, and all case documentation for the first 3 years, and made the first comprehensive electronic database for Jane's murder. In a late 2018 department memo requesting funding for sophisticated DNA testing, Clark reiterated that evidence had never been an issue in the case. The gap had always been in tying it to someone, especially amid the kinds of institutional pressures that plagued the original investigation. She was arguing that genetic genealogy could finally provide the break needed to find Jane's killer, and with it, perhaps some uncomfortable truths long buried. Her request was approved in January 2019, thus setting in motion what was going to be the final chapter of a story that had actually started almost 50 years prior. On February 12, 2019, Amelia Clark carefully sealed the package containing the semen sample from Jane Briton's underwear, roughly the size of a small notebook, with the sort of reverence one might accord to a sacred relic. To Clark, it represented the last real hope of solving a case that had haunted generations of investigators and the Briton family for 50 years. She later recalled thinking, "This is it. Either it works or we have to accept that Jane's case might never be solved in a truly satisfying way." The samples were sent to Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia, one of the handful of private labs that specialize in genetic genealogy for law enforcement agencies. This revolutionary new method of DNA analysis had emerged from an improbable blend of recreational ancestry testing, big data, and old-fashioned forensic science. Unlike the DNA testing usually done by police, which seeks an exact match in criminal databases, genetic genealogy identifies suspects through their distant relatives, those people who submitted DNA to ancestry services for reasons unrelated to apprehending criminals. The technique had already solved dozens of cold cases since its first high-profile success in 2018. Dr. Eleonora Wright, the forensic genetic genealogist assigned to Jane's case, explained it this way: traditional DNA analysis is like finding someone by their exact address. Genetic genealogy is like locating them by finding their cousins, then deducing where they likely live from those family connections. The first challenge was the DNA itself. After 48 years, despite careful preservation, the sample had degraded significantly. Dr. Wright reported receiving only 0.3 nanograms of highly fragmented DNA, normally far too little for analysis. But thanks to modern whole genome amplification, the lab was able to create sufficient copies of the fragments to proceed. Initial testing did not find a direct match. However, it did reveal 19 people who shared enough genetic markers to be distant relatives of the killer. Mostly third and fourth cousins, most probably strangers to him, sharing great-great-grandparents. From there, the team constructed huge family trees dating back 6 generations and encompassing upwards of 2,800 individuals. They started whittling down their target list based on what was known about the killer. Male, probably 18 to 40 years old in 1969, with some contact to the Cambridge or Boston area. That gave a pool of 42 potential suspects. Further refinement, based on geographic concentration, timing, and criminal history, narrowed it to just 8 men. On April 2, 2019, Sergeant Clark got the shortlist. She expected names she'd never heard before. Instead, she saw familiar names from long-forgotten corners of the criminal justice system. There was Michael Sumpter. A brief examination of the digitized case files showed that Sumpter had no obvious connection to Harvard or Jane Briton, but he was familiar to Cambridge and Boston police, a lifelong criminal with a long history of violent crimes, including serial rape and murder, usually against young women. He had also been a suspect in the 1972 murder of a 23-year-old brunette who looked like Jane. Sumpter had died in prison in 2000. It was a short leap to the emergent working theory. Sumpter, on parole in January 1969, may have been surveilling Jane. He climbed a fire escape, found an open window, entered, and then sexually assaulted and murdered her. This fit the pattern of a known violent serial offender, neatly solving the mystery of a stranger attack. Yet critical questions remained. Becky Cooper, whose investigative work helped to reignite the case, felt an increasing unease. Sumpter's DNA could explain the biological evidence, but it didn't explain the red ochre, that ritualistic, symbolic detail that had haunted the case for decades. And how could such a violent, intrusive entry have happened without anyone noticing in a building known for its lax security? The case was the closest it had ever been, but right now the puzzle wasn't complete either. No witnesses or disturbance, considering the intimacy of the scene indicated by the wine glasses and the original assessment of no forced entry. Prior to making the information public, Sergeant Clark had to have the genetic link absolutely confirmed. As Michael Sumpter was deceased, routine surreptitious collection was not possible. However, the state crime laboratory still had a DNA sample on file regarding Sumpter from his later convictions. On April 7th, the results arrived. The DNA from Michael Sumpter's archived sample matched the DNA from Jane Briton's underwear, with a probability of 99.9998%. After 48 long years, Jane Briton's killer finally had a name. Clark recalled sitting at her desk, staring at the report, her emotions vacillating between elation and horror. Elation that they finally had an answer. Horror because so many questions still remained, and because the resolution put in stark light decades of investigative and institutional failures. The horror was deepened by how the long-held insider theory, as suggested by the red ochre ritual, contrasted with the revelation of a stranger, a career criminal who could no longer speak for himself. News of Michael Sumpter's identification spread like wildfire through Cambridge. By noon, every local news outlet had broken the story. The Cambridge District Attorney's Office, in concert with the Chief of Police, framed the closure as a triumph of modern forensics, finally delivering justice to a decades-old mystery. The official narrative was neat and simple. A predatory serial criminal, previously unknown to Jane, had seized an opportunity presented by lax security. But for many, the official story created profound cognitive dissonance. Former investigators, academics, and Jane's surviving family struggled with the convenience of the conclusion versus the persistent, unsettling questions. Commander Brennan was now fully retired and accepted the official closure. Yet he admitted to private unease. Sumpter was a monster, yes, but a random monster climbing a fire escape and leaving a ritualistic archaeological symbol on the body? That just doesn't fit the picture we always had, or the specifics of that scene. It was a conflict in which Becky Cooper, who had been researching the case for 10 years, found herself the focal point. The DA's version would have made that ending neat and closed, but the story was far too complex to be so simple. She reflected, the DNA match doesn't explain the red ochre. And how could he have done it without anyone seeing or hearing a struggle? All we know for sure is that Michael Sumpter had sex with her. That doesn't prove he committed the murder. The original police assessment of no forced entry, combined with the evidence of apparent consensual intimacy, clashed sharply with Sumpter's known modus operandi as a violent serial rapist and killer. For many, the horror of Sumpter's identification lay not just in solving the cold case, but from how it went against decades of investigative assumptions. The long-held belief had been that the red ochre and intimate scene pointed to someone Jane knew, probably an academic. Sumpter, a career criminal with no connection to Harvard's anthropology department, was fundamentally challenging that theory. His death meant that there could be no public trial, no rigorous cross-examination, and no full exploration of how the crime had actually come to pass. For many observers, this was the most troubling aspect. It feels like they picked the easiest answer, not necessarily the truest, retired Cambridge detective Daniel Albright, who had worked under Senate in the 70s, said anonymously to the Boston Globe. A dead serial killer can't talk. A dead serial killer doesn't implicate the university or police failures. These were revelations that the community struggled to grapple with in real time. Impromptu memorials appeared at 6 University Road, where flowers were laid by students who knew Jane only as a historical figure, now brought into tragic focus. Yet at the same time, heated debates erupted in campus forums and local coffee shops. Many struggled to reconcile the initial theories of an insider with the scientific identification of a brutal outsider. The news also spurred renewed criticism of Harvard's historical response. Students questioned how a Harvard-owned building could have such abysmal security, particularly given Jane's father's prominent role at Radcliffe. Dean Charles Prescott, who had expressed deep agitation over the university's reputation back in 1969, had long since retired and passed away, leaving the next generation to wrestle with the legacy of secrecy, scandal, and the painful lessons of institutional failure. His successor, Dean Stephen R. Halberg, formally apologized on behalf of Harvard for the serious lapses in campus security and transparency that had prolonged the uncertainty about Jane Briton's tragic death. This apology, in very stark contrast to Harvard's initial response, was a clear attempt to repair its image in the midst of renewed public and media attention. To the Briton family, the identification of Michael Sumpter brought an array of complex emotion. Ruth Briton, 94 and living in assisted care, received the news personally from Sergeant Amelia Clark. Clark recalled Ruth simply nodding and saying, "An answer, not the one I expected, but an answer." It was a quiet, factual acknowledgement. No triumph, no dramatic emotion, from a woman who had never stopped believing justice would come, even if it was only partial. Now in his early 60s, the respected investigative journalist Boyd Briton Jr. became the public voice of the family. Continuing to push for a deeper understanding of the case itself, he focused on systemic issues that obscured the full truth for so long. He wrote a scathing national op-ed entitled "The Convenient Killer," where, though admitting that Sumpter is undoubtedly violent, the rush to close the case ignored unique ritualistic elements and overlooked potential institutional negligence. "My sister's case became a casualty of Harvard's reputation and the police department's need for a clean solve," he wrote. "DNA gave them a name, but it didn't give us the whole truth. It didn't explain the ochre. It didn't explain why a violent stranger left the scene without a struggle or signs of forced entry. It allowed uncomfortable questions to be buried beneath a convenient answer. With Sumpter identified and deceased, there was no trial." The Cambridge District Attorney's Office formally closed the case on April 15, 2019, classifying it as solved through DNA evidence. The announcement marked the end of an official investigation spanning 5 decades, but for many, it didn't provide closure, only renewed focus on the lingering ambiguities and questions of institutional accountability. The reaction from the academic and local community was swift and varied. Harvard moved to distance itself from the historical controversy while publicly acknowledging its past failings. President Lawrence S. Baca announced the creation of the Jane Briton Fellowship in Archaeological Ethics, a scholarship promoting ethical research, mentorship, and campus safety improvements. The Peabody Museum, where Jane had spent so much of her research time, launched a public lecture series titled "Unearthing Truths: Archaeology and Society," reflecting on the intersection of academic pursuits and real-world consequences. The Cambridge Police Department, under new leadership, launched an internal review of the 1969 investigation, conceding that historical limitations and oversight may have affected the original efforts. While it does not admit to mistakes or a cover-up per se, the statement allows room for the interpretation that critical leads or alternative theories may have been prematurely dismissed. Critical to that identification was the tenacity of Sergeant Amelia Clark, the cold case investigator who ultimately identified Sumpter. Even she, however, found herself defending the official narrative against unrelenting media questions. In the pages of a prominent Boston Globe interview, she chose her words with care. We followed the science. The DNA conclusively connected Sumpter to Jane Briton. What brought him to the apartment, the details of the interaction, and the meaning of the red ochre? Those are questions a deceased suspect cannot answer. But we have identified the perpetrator of the sexual assault and murder, her wording. Separating the DNA match apart from the ritualistic details did not go unnoticed, especially by Boyd Briton Jr. In the months after the DNA identification, Jane's case went from an unsolved mystery to a rather complex teaching tool. The FBI added it to its training curriculum as a stunning example of how genetic genealogy could solve decades-old cases, but also as a continuing challenge when motives remained unresolved and evidence was inconsistent. Forensic science programs discuss the cases regarding evidence preservation and ethical interpretation of DNA when the rest of the evidence remained unexplained. Across the country, law enforcement reopened and reviewed cold case files with fresh optimism and a critical eye on long-held assumptions. For Becky Cooper, the resolution brought neither triumph nor full closure. In interviews following the DNA announcement, she wrestled with how to square her years of investigation and the haunting possibility of institutional complicity with this final identification of a long-dead stranger. If people need someone to blame, she told the Boston Globe, perhaps the only person left is already dead. In this manner, the resignation and defiance of her statement, acknowledging, as it were, that though science had spoken, larger human truths in the form of power, privilege, and silence lived and remained unresolved. Jane Marie Briton's legacy extended beyond her tragic death to include scientific progress inspired by her case, the advocacy that her brother pursued, and the uncomfortable questions of justice, reputation, and truth that her story continues to pose. On the first anniversary of Sumpter's identification, Ruth Briton died peacefully at age 95. Boyd Jr.'s obituary noted that she was alive to witness her daughter's killer identified, but left behind a son who continued the search for the fuller truth behind the convenient answer. It was a life mission for Ruth with regards to Jane's justice, which was complete, though the complete story remained elusive, a permanent shadow in the fabric of Harvard and Cambridge history.